Hi there. Thanks so much for joining us. This is our annual wrap up of the admissions season, and we're looking at 2021, 2022 tonight. And I'm Bari Norman. I'm going to hand the mic over to Leslie Singer, our moderator and host tonight. So Leslie, I'll let you take it from here while everyone's queuing into the room.
Okay. Hi, I'm Leslie Singer of Brown Harris Stevens, and welcome to an insider's guide to college admissions. Tonight we have Sasha DeWind, the CEO of Tutor Associates, Bari Norman, who just spoke, co-founder and head counselor, Expert Admissions, and Melanie White, Director of College Counseling, Grace Church School. I think we want to start the evening first by having a poll so we know who our audience is. And Bari, I'm going to let you start that.
Yes, we are wanting to get a sense of the audience in terms of the year that you or your student is, so that we can adjust content accordingly, particularly as those of you who have ninth graders or younger to see. So we'll give everybody a little bit of time because numbers are still coming in.
Sure.
And it looks like it's still coming in, but it looks like we've got about 54% in 11th grade, 56%, it's moving around a little bit in 11th grade, 29% in 10th grade, 11% 9th grade, and just 2% in 12th grade, and a little bit of other. So we've got mostly juniors here. More than half of the audience is juniors and about a third 10th graders. Thank you.
Well, that's great to know. Let's start out with testing. Even though we have a lot of 11th graders, are kids testing and taking ACT, SAT in person?
Yeah, for all intents and purposes, things are back to normal in some ways. Our kids are testing in person. And, unlike sort of the peak of the crisis, that there's been no issues in terms of reserving testing or having testing sites closed. So just in terms of how things are running, everything's running kind of as normal. And kids are testing. They've been testing all fall. The juniors are testing. They just had April ACT. Hopefully most of them right now are just busy, if they're juniors, with school and some sort of sleep and their extracurriculars. Hopefully there's not too much insane testing happening right this moment. But yes, juniors have been testing, will test this summer and this upcoming fall. And certainly current sophomores are just beginning the process, as they do kind of every year, of should I test, which test, when, and this process kind of is starting now and goes through like the sort of early summer. Well, for me, that's when I like to do it because I like to have a plan, but sort of it's the beginning stages for those 10th graders. And ninth graders, we'll talk to you and we'll help you understand what's coming, but there's absolutely nothing you need to be doing from a standardized perspective right now.
I guess for those 11th graders, they're probably going to want to know who's requiring tests next year.
Sure. And I know Bari can speak to this too, and Melanie. But as far as I know, right now, MIT's on the record saying that they'll expect scores. I believe Stanford as well, expecting scores. Georgetown, I think, asks and has asked for a very specific reason you weren't able to test for public health reasons. So, there are some schools who are requiring them. I think the large trend overwhelmingly is to kind of stay test optional, at least for this one more year. For some, it's more than one more year and we can pull those out. But I think like overwhelmingly, you're going to feel that if you're a current junior, most schools are going to give you this year too as test optional. And then we'll talk about what test optional means and if it's right for your child. But right now, again, we'll talk to the 10th graders, we'll talk to the 9th graders, but right now, if you're a junior, you're in a heavily test optional atmosphere with a few requiring.
But let's elaborate on test optional, both from you, Barry, Melanie, please, because there's a lot of confusion
Sure.
over test optional, truly test
I'll let
optional.
them speak, because that's, I mean,
Okay.
certainly like I can just say the logistics of it, but they can
Please.
sort of speak to what does it mean in admissions?
Exactly.
Well, I think we should start by saying while the sort of tsunami of it has occurred because of the pandemic, test optional is a policy that many colleges have had, particularly liberal arts colleges, for some years now, and some for 40 years or so. So it's not altogether new, and there are a great many institutions that is very much how their admissions process has been structured, and structured holistically, and giving the student the option as to whether or not to have that. I think even pre-pandemic, something like half of the top 40, the top 50 of the US News and World Report, the liberal arts colleges were already test optional. So it's become something that is pretty universal, with the occasional exception, as Sasha pointed out. And I think it's been something that has worked tremendously well for the colleges, right? Because it sort of frees them up. So testing, it can still be a very important data point in an application or for the admissions office, but the test optional gives the family, gives the student the power, the control of that. And so testing is just no longer as dominant or as high stakes as it was 3 years ago. And while I know our students, and I would say my advice broadly is students should prepare their testing, they should take their tests, but then it's really a question as to whether or not, institution by institution, they're going to share those scores. So I think that we still see a lot of students testing, really, as we should, but then it just becomes a question of, do I want to be judged on these scores right at the specific institution? And if they choose not to, there is no penalty to that, as opposed to if you send scores that are merely average or even lower than average, you're asking to be judged on it. So there is a downside to sending scores if they aren't top scores for that institution.
I think, I agree with that. I think also, and very much, I think the point is an important one, like an active penalty. Yes, if you send relatively low scores to an institution, you can have an active penalty for doing so. It can knock you out, period. And sending high scores, we know, just means you've cleared the bar. It doesn't get you in by itself. One thing that we've seen is certainly that it's easier to predict if you can give good scores, whatever that means. Again, like Melanie said, institution by institution. But if you can give good scores, that you can predict better what might happen. And I haven't collected the data, but there have been a lot of test prep companies and other people have collected the data. And you can see at some schools, like at an Emory, you have more than twice as good a chance to get in if you submit scores or don't. So I think it is an institution by institution thing. I think the really nice thing about test optional for students is for those who wouldn't have scored at a certain level for particular schools that you're interested in, you do now actually have a chance. Whereas before, like Melanie said, you would have been required to submit them. And those in and of itself may have knocked you out. Now you actually have a fighting chance. It doesn't mean that it can't be true at the same time that you have a better chance, or you might have a certainly, again, better predictive ability if you give them strong scores. So both things can be true at the same time. It can be truly test optional and benefit certain students at certain institutions. And it can also be in your best interest, if you're able to give them the scores. And I think the confusion sometimes comes is that people think it has to be one or the other. And the truth is like everything in college admissions, it's very nuanced. It's very particular to each student. And like Melanie said, it's also particular to institutions. So we have students who submit their scores to half the schools on their list and not to the other half, because you're going to make a different call based on your scores and the schools you're applying to.
And I wanted to sort of speak to that because it's in the chat as well. Like, well, what is a top score? What is a good score? What's a score that helps? When do these scores even need to be submitted? So I wanted to just go back to some of the logistics of these tests, and then we can certainly talk about obviously all of Leslie's questions. I know we have so many, but in terms of what is a good score, that's Barry's point. It's so perfectly made in is that it depends on the school, and they really are pretty clear in their reports. You can find it. They report usually the 25th to 75th percentile of admitted students, the scores that they had. So if you want to know what Yale's scores look like, or Georgetown's or Bowdoin's, you can find them, and they release those scores. And what they're telling you is that, sure, there are some kids who did above that range. So maybe the range is 31 to 34 on the ACT, which is out of 36. Maybe that's the range. And sure, some kids got 35s and 36s, and certainly some kids got below a 31, but most of the kids got somewhere between that 31 and 34. And so that's like the safe range for that school. And Barry and I are always like pushing for that top end of that range. We want your scores to like help their averages, help them, but that's so that's actually so concrete, because it really is out there. Like, what Vassar is not Georgetown, is not Duke, is not Dartmouth, is not, they all have different ranges and different sort of ideas about what a top applicant would have. And I think that the other thing I wanted to highlight is Barry said, it's not what gets you in. And I think that's so important. It's a thing that gets you over like this big hurdle for certain places and certain moments. And it's not the thing that then makes the determinant choice between you and another child. So Barry never says to me, that child didn't get in because her score was a 34 and not a 35, or 35 instead of 36. It's like it's always more complicated than that, right? At a certain, once you get to a certain level. And so I urge you to research the school's specific ranges, understand what those ranges mean, and then understand what like sort of safe means, and what being at the sort of 75th percentile and above means, and what kind of applicant you are. So that's what is a good score. On the ACT, there's a whole, what is a good score? It depends on where you're applying. Kids are usually going for scores in the 30s, but depends on the kid. And we have all sorts
Sasha, I'll add just to hop on, sorry, real fast, is that we also saw that in post-test optional more broadly, is that band of what that 25th to 75th percentile is has narrowed and moved up, right? Because now that students, like Melanie said, now that they have the control, you're not sending it unless they're really good. And so the range has also narrowed, which is also important as you're assessing, do I send my scores? Now, what's good, even at individual schools, has changed just in the last 2 years. And so just make sure that you're looking at data that's current.
So then
I also want to
conversations, I would say, with students who have very good scores for which they've worked very hard, and yet we'll say, look, for those couple of schools, don't send it. It doesn't stand out. And it feels terrible, because it feels like you are telling the child that that's not a great score, that their work, or that somehow that value there isn't there. But it isn't there for that school, for exactly why Barry just explained, is those averages have gone up so much because only half the applicants are sending in their scores. I've had multiple conversations with admissions representative, one fellow in particular at a highly selective school, who said, I've never read an application and wished that there were scores, but I have certainly read apps this year and had wished that they hadn't sent the score, right? And he's talking about very high scores. That seems sort of ludicrously high for that to be their top 25th percentile, which is really sort of what we like the kids to have it in order to send it. But it's true. At some places, it's true.
And I also want to say, we're talking to a specific group, but there are other kids for whom scores are scholarships. They have all sorts of other repercussions outside of just admissions. So I just wanted to say, this is very specifically about like very elite admissions, because scores can mean other things for kids beyond that as well. Sorry, Leslie, go ahead.
No. And we kind of jumped into scores, but for those who are in 10th grade, Sasha, can you talk about, like, how do I know if my child's an ACT person, an SAT person?
Yeah,
please.
Sure. So 10th graders, you're still going to have the sort of current situation. There's a current SAT. We'll talk about the new one in a second, but there's a SAT right now you could take, and an ACT. And if your child is in 10th grade or you're a 10th grader, you can plan on next year looking like it has for many years, which is that you'll pick one of those two tests. You will test sometime in the fall, winter, or spring, depending on who you are and what your needs are. Maybe you'll even test again in the summer or fall of your senior year, again, depending on where you're starting, where you're going, your sports, your life, your all sorts of your math class. We'll talk about all that. And these are paper tests, and you're going to find out the right one by taking a full length SAT practice test. That's a real one, and a real ACT, not real like it'll count, but real like a full past one. And sometimes it's really obvious. One is just so much stronger than the other. And so the full length diagnostic just does the work for everyone. Everyone loves one over the other. Everyone thinks one's so much obviously better. Sometimes the scores aren't so different, but the qualitative sort of experience was very different. The child has a strong preference. It may come down to other things, but there's a very clear process for sort of diagnosing where you are. And there's lots of factors that go into which test might be right for your child. The ACT is a test that, they really both test math, and they both test grammar, and they both test reading, and they both ask your kids to kind of look at some graphs and answer some questions. So the big picture, they're comparable tests, right? I don't want to overstate that. But if I were to really sit you down and have you take them, which gosh, these kids go through so much, they really are so different. The ACT asks you to move so quickly. The SAT gives you really enough time to do what's asked for most kids. So you already start to see that there's like a very different game being played on the ACT, right? It's just a different game, different rules. But the ACT, it's a very predictable game. So even if you don't love that game, it's so predictable. And I love a predictable game if you're trying to beat a game. The SAT, it's not like quite as predictable a game. It's a little different. So there's a different kind of brain that likes that, and a different kind of student who thrives. But simple answer is take full length diagnostics. Don't do a hybrid. Just take full length diagnostics, have them proctored, not at home by real, take them real in a simulated environment, and then start diving into those results in an educated way. What do they mean? From there, you can come up with a plan. And for some kids, it's obvious. And for some kids, it takes more digging.
Thank you. Both for Bari and Melanie, what are some of the key takeaways from 2022 results that applicants in 2023 should keep in mind?
I think there's a number of them, I think, but I know that people are quite focused on selectivity and how difficult it was. And there's always war stories at the end of every cycle. And this year, certainly no different. I think test optional has, as we predicted and we knew would happen, it's increased the number of applications pretty much across the board at institutions. Obviously, admit rates go down because it's rare that a college is increasing their class size. There are a couple of places that are doing that, but that's happening sort of separate. So you've got admit rates going down. You've got applications going up. Because of test optional, like we said before, people who before either would not have shown up in the pool or would have shown up in the pool but easily got knocked out on the basis of scores now are real competitive applicants. Institutional priorities have shifted and shift every year. And so all of these things kind of coming together. And plus, by the way, one of the biggest things is the over-enrollment that happened at so many institutions last year. So you've got all these things kind of happening, sending admit rates plummeting. And then we saw students, I think, across the board, and we were having a conversation about this a little bit earlier, that I've seen across our listservs and from colleagues, where you have students who really got kind of caught in a tough spot this year, where they didn't quite make it into their higher level schools. And then some of the schools that they thought would be safer didn't take them either because they assumed those kids wouldn't come. But those kids didn't have the typical choices or options that they would normally have. And I think one thing that's a takeaway from this year, unfortunately, is that people have to probably apply to some more schools next year, which again is going to cause the same issue, right? More applications and less predictability. But the real key is to have a range of schools, to know your schools well, to show love to all of your schools. Don't take for granted that you think you're definitely getting into a school or that one's going to be so easy. Even pre-test optional, pre-pandemic, they weren't, no school that usually, for at least that our students are applying to, they're not taking all the people who are higher and looking at them as safer options, right? Not all of those kids were ever getting in, and more of those kids are not getting in. So you really have to know your school, show the love through demonstrated interest, through better supplemental essays that are more tailored, that are not just like, I like this subject, you have this subject, and you have this professor and this experience that I'm going to take advantage of. That gives them no reason to admit you over another history major or another bio major. And so I think the onus really is on the applicant, you know, to really show up, do your due diligence, get those applications in tip-top shape, and don't just put together a list of schools that kind of normally get lumped together, but there should be a very specific reason for you, for each of your schools, why it's on your list. And from my perspective, more importantly, you should know relative to one another why each school is on your list. Again, so not just because they tend to congregate together or people tend to mention them in the same breath, but you should know sort of reasons why school A and B, why one is better than the other for you, and how the schools on your list are different from one another, not just how they're the same. And I think that's a big blind spot for a lot of people, where there can be a real difference in the quality of the essays and the results at the end.
I do think a wise use, because of many of those things that Bari just pointed out, a really wise use of early decision and early action, it becomes even more critical. I think back in the day, it was just to the school, you know, you absolutely loved, and if there wasn't one, that was fine. And I think increasingly that's not really the case. If a school is filling 50 to 60% of their class, of their seats through ED, then that's probably something you should at least think about and talk seriously about. Not just early decision one, but often early decision two, right? To have that sort of second plan there. I think the overshooting in ED2, right, applying to a comparably selective institution as perhaps did not admit you in ED1, is a tripping point, can be a tripping point, as well as not taking advantage of early action, sort of where it exists. I think for some institutions, early action is where they see all of their applications now, and regular decision is really would be more appropriately named late decision, really, because they're just not many seats left by the time they get to that point, because of choices they have made, that institution has made, about how they want to fill their class. Like they've got the apps, and that's what they've decided to do. So I think being aware of that, and it isn't the same every place. Early action isn't used the same way at every school, but I think really being aware of that. And then a point that Bari made, I think increasingly the major a student is saying, even at a smaller school, the major that a student is indicating they're interested in can bear weight in this process, and they should be able to back it up, but also be really thoughtful about it, and perhaps not be saying what is clearly the most popular major right at that institution, and then on the assumption that, you know, the apps that are coming in are going to disproportionately be whatever that major might be at that institution. And I just think students, I think as things get even more selective, it's just being savvy around these areas that can help, just really help a family, help a student kind of feel on top of things, and that they've done everything they could possibly do.
Yeah, and to add to the point of the majors is that, particularly when you're thinking about things like business is a really obvious one. Like a lot of students will say they're interested in business, but you have to pretty much understand that that's going to be more difficult in almost every instance. And you really got to think hard. Is it that important to you to be in the business program, or do you want to be at a particular school or level of school? And sometimes students can kind of, again, certain schools, they might apply one way versus another, but really, really think, because there are plenty of schools that admit by major, big and small. Mostly, you know, the bigger schools tend to do it more unilaterally, but you really want to think about that. You know, engineering is another one. And sometimes students can go either way. Sometimes schools will enable, it's fairly easy to go into business once you're there. Sometimes it's only, you got your one shot when you come in as a first year. But really be, like Melanie said, you have to be savvy about all the different pieces. And she was mentioning, you know, backing it up. And that's, you know, like I was saying before on the essays, that just saying, people think tailoring is just like mentioning things like check boxes. If that's what you're doing, the essay is not going to hustle for you. And so you really want to be thoughtful about how you approach it and how you present your case in a way. And so, yeah, just super, super, super important. And with the ED and EA point that Melanie was making, not only have they filled a lot of their class, but you've got so many kids who don't get in EA and ED who are extraordinary, who then start swimming in the pools with you. And so you have to remember, not only are there so many fewer spots, but you've got, I always say it's like swimming with the sharks in regular. You've got just an extraordinary number of extraordinary students who would have, could have, and should have gotten in another year or in another time, who are also in those pools, making it even more competitive.
Can you elaborate a bit on ED, ED2, and early action? You mentioned them, but and strategies around that.
Yeah, I mean, so the early pool.
Yeah.
Just as a quick thing, so ED is early decision. You can only apply to one place early decision at a time, because if you apply and they take you, you have to go. So you can only do that with one place. Now there are different rounds of early decisions. So you've got ED1, which is usually a November 1st, November 15th deadline. You hear usually by mid-December. Then there's a second round of early decision that usually coincides with a college's regular decision deadline around January 1, sometimes January 15th. This is also binding. It's just a later deadline. A lot of colleges in the past have said, it's just for people who haven't decided early or need more time. But of course, this is for people who tried in the first round, did not get in, and are coming back for a second round. And it's to your advantage because, again, they know they're going to get 100% yield on their offer if they take you. Historically, ED2, I felt, our experience was that there were fewer kids being taken in ED2. I think especially in this test optional environment, I've seen certainly an increase in the use of ED2 at certain institutions, more kids getting in that second round and then filling still more seats in the second round. Early action is also an early deadline, usually around November 1-ish, November 15th, hearing either mid-December or increasingly sometime in late or mid-January, even into February, but basically applying early, hearing earlier than March, which is when regular decision tends to come out, and you're not bound to go if they take you. So you still have until May 1st of your senior year to tell them if you want to come. You can still have active applications and see how things pan out and then make a decision. But as Melanie was saying earlier, for certain schools, certainly the ones that don't have ED, EA can be a real boost and a real strategic advantage. There are increasing number of schools that have ED and EA, and there's differences in terms of the strategic boost one would get at an institution that offers both. But I always say, in an ideal world, you get the deal done in early if you can, and if there's a place that you feel good enough about, that you want to be. I don't think it has to be the biggest love affair of your life with a school for ED, but it does need to be a place you feel really good about because you're going if they take you. And so I think sometimes students feel a certain amount of pressure to love and fall in love. And I think you need to fall in real in a nice hard with a place and say, I'd be happy here. And I always encourage students to think longer term, right? Because if it didn't work out and you find yourself in a tougher spot in regular, are you happier then that you saw it through and maybe went down a notch or a tier in selectivity? For some kids, that's worth it. For other kids, not so much. And there's no right or wrong. But strategically getting in an early decision round it's not easy, but it's a lot easier. And also, again, a lot more predictable. So if you can make it happen, and gauge it right, a reach, but not too reachy, it can be a really, really good thing.
How do you express demonstrated interest?
That's a great question. Not every institution, let me explain what it is, but not every institution is tracking that. And demonstrated interest is when a school wants to know, when a school is tracking how much has a student, what does a student know, and how have they demonstrated their interest, right, in a college, their knowledge of a college. And that could be signing up and doing something online, that could be visiting in person, that could be talking to a representative at a college fair or at a high school visit, it could be following up with an email. There's lots of different ways. If they get invited to some kind of reception in New York City, going to that. It could be as simple as clicking through the emails that they receive, right? There are colleges that track whether the child has opened and clicked through, right, the emails. And if they do that, that's a demonstration of interest, because the college doesn't want to, as they see it, waste and admit on a student who has absolutely no interest in coming, right? Whose first demonstration of interest was the application arriving at the college, right? And they're, in my experience, they're often right, you know, when they think like, oh, she's not really that interested in our school. And it's like, yep, guess what? In a little bit, I think this is what Bari was talking about earlier, of kids sort of getting shut out of places perhaps they took for granted. And a student should demonstrate interest because they are actually interested, right? So it doesn't sort of have to be this onerous thing. Like you want to learn about a school and you want to take the opportunities, or at least many of the opportunities that you have to learn about a school. There are sort of categories of school who don't pay attention to that. And, you know, usually the most selective places are not, because frankly, they assume that you want to be there. Mostly public institutions are not. Jesuit institutions, in the most part, are also not taking demonstrated interest into account. But many schools are. I don't want to generally. Sometimes it's smaller schools, but not exclusively. So it's important not to just throw a college onto the list without knowing why it's there. And having investigated it, because the college may be paying attention to that.
Yeah, and there's a flip side also. Sometimes students think that the more they demonstrate interest, the better. And you can kind of go too far with it. Like they want to send emails to the admissions rep and they have nothing really to say, or they want to go in and shake somebody's hand. And again, they don't really have valid or thoughtful and substantive questions. So, you know, don't be the person who's the pain, you know, like do it in the appropriate ways, like Melanie was explaining. But don't try and think, well, I better email my admissions rep with, you know, kind of these basic questions, just because then they'll see I emailed them. You can kind of go in the other direction too. So just be mindful of that.
You mentioned before that there's an increase in applications, or that people, so can you suggest how many applications people should be submitting? Do you have a number in mind? Are you recommending a certain number?
Do you do that, Bari? Do you have a number?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think it depends, you know, like I would say on average, we say 8 to 10, you know, after 10, it's like, it's a lot, you know, and having 10 solid schools and doing good work on them for application wise is really tough. You know, I've had students who have a list of 7 schools. It's very efficient and very tidy, and it works just fine for them. It depends what you like, and it depends what your counselor says, you know, in terms of your chances. And, you know, do you need to branch out a bit, and how balanced is it? So there's so much that goes into it that I hate to kind of give like just a number, but I know people want to have some sense. So I would say around 8 to 10 ish.
Because more is not necessarily better. Again, you get spread too thin, you can't do a good job on the supplements if they exist. So.
Some schools won't let you.
Just the more randomly random ones that you throw in, like maybe one will work, as if this really is a totally random process. And it can certainly feel random, but it's not random. You know, there's an element of unpredictability that doesn't make it random. You know, there is a method to the madness at each institution. Whether you know what that method is or how well you know that, that's another story. But remember that just kind of throwing more things out there doesn't necessarily increase your chances at all.
Sasha, you were going to comment.
I was just saying some schools limit, some high schools limit how many they really will let you, you know, I know there are schools who say 7 is the sort of top, or 8, or no more than 10, or certain amount of public institutions, certain amount of private. And I know there are questions already in the chat about, you know,
Yeah.
can you do ED and EA?
Yep.
So I guess that's
You
full.
elaborate.
Yes, absolutely. You can. You can do as many EAs as you want, unless it's a restricted EA, excuse me. So, you know, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, Georgetown has some restrictions as well, but it's really essentially just those, like a handful of schools. But generally speaking, you can do EA doesn't restrict you unless you have one of those particular schools. It's the ED one that you can only do one at a time. But if you do ED1, you don't get in, either deferred, by the way, deferred or denied. And then you can go into the ED2 round and try again. Or you have a place like Wake Forest that opens their ED application at the end of junior year. You can try that in July and then try something in November and something again in January. You know, so there's always like a little funky exception here or there, but absolutely, you know, again, unless it's a school that has a restricted EA. And in those instances, in almost all those instances, the restriction is you can't apply to another private institution, EA or ED, but you can apply to public institutions that have EA. So if you're applying to Harvard in restricted early action, you can apply to Michigan or UVA or University of Texas, UNC, you know, any of those, but you can't apply to USC because USC is a private school. You can't apply to, they have one deadline, so it's actually not a great example. University of Chicago is a private school that has EA. Chicago doesn't care if you apply somewhere else, but Harvard would care that you applied there, so you can't do it. So you have to look at the restrictions when they're in place. But generally speaking, you can do EA and ED at the same time.
I don't know if Melanie had more to contribute. No, not necessarily. Okay. In terms of extracurriculars, are there certain extracurriculars that you recommend are important? Can you talk a little bit about
things they like to do, you know, right? Things that they want to spend their time on and feel compelling. I think we often get the question about summer activities specifically.
Yes, and that too. That was going to be.
It's, well, what didn't you have the time to do during the school year? And what, you know, what does the student want to do? And it really can take any shape or form or be anywhere. And in fact, I actually think something that requires sort of more initiative and ingenuity and independence for a child is better than sort of like a prepackaged program. And I have always say a job is a great idea. And I do think in the current sort of labor market that high school students can get a job in this summer. And I think that can be a great thing.
Yeah, I would agree. I think people sometimes get a little like trigger happy on like classes, and I often find early in high school maybe, but additional classes aren't any, there's nothing special about those. Or people ask about, if I do a program at a particular college, does that increase my chances? And in pretty much every instance, the answer is no. It's not going to increase your chances at Columbia if you do the Columbia program, or Harvard if you do the Harvard program, or whatever. And like Melanie was saying, doing something that you actually enjoy, you're more likely to take it farther, to do it better, to do more with it, and certainly to be able to talk about it in a more compelling way, as opposed to just doing something because you're checking the box. Academically, particularly at more selective schools, we have such a narrow band academically for what's going to be competitive. But the beauty of the extracurricular piece is that it's wide open. They really, truly need all different kinds of people. They need someone who's going to write on the paper, and who's going to do the improv group, and who's going to run the sustainability initiative, and who's going to jam with the band, and whatever. So do what you actually enjoy. This is the one area where you really can. Whereas when it comes to course selection, I wouldn't suggest leading with interests necessarily. But extracurricularly, you really can just do what you want. I do think it's important to be involved in your school to some degree. So I'd like to do everything outside of school, I think is probably, you want to think about that. But, so kind of showing that you're a community member at your school, and then certainly doing things outside as well.
And I also don't think all programs are created equal. I know what Bari's saying, like there's not like you go to the Columbia thing or the Brown thing and you get in. That's exactly right. But there are programs that are really competitive to get into that take, and the Yale Global Scholars is one. There are many that are really take quite a bit of work and scholarly excellence to, and the colleges know the difference between the ones that everybody can just like basically pay to do, like pay to take a class at Columbia, and the programs at these schools, some of the engineering programs. I mean, Bari knows them better than I do. Melanie does too. But, I do want to also be clear that like when you are engaging with these programs, if you are doing that, they're not all created equally. And you have to understand what's taken seriously and what's not taken seriously.
And even with like a Yale Young Global Scholars program, like attending by in and of itself is not going to do anything for you. Like there's a lot of kids there. That program has expanded quite a bit over the years. It's much larger now than it used to be. But it's what you get out of it. It's not just, oh, I did this, I got into this selective program, and so now like I have a leg up in the process. Yes, you got into this selective program, but what did you get out of it? And what happened after you left? Just going and passively taking in whatever was given to you or shared with you, again, is not going to be enough in a selective or highly selective pool. So even if you get into a program that actually legitimately is more selective, it always is going to matter how you communicate what you got out of it in your application. And the same thing with where you go to college. Just going to a school isn't going to make everyone just come and offer you a job. It's what do you do with the experience, no matter where you are. So just important to keep that in mind as well.
We have questions about the West Coast schools and testing on the West Coast. Sasha, do you want to comment on this and what's happening on the West Coast schools?
Yeah, it's ever changing because it's like in the courts, right? But no, but at the moment, the UC schools are test blind, which is really different from test optional, right? So before we've been talking about these schools where, your scores can benefit or they can hurt you, or they can just be absent from your application. And that's what the test optional, right? That's where that strategic decision comes in. And test blind means they're not looking at any scores, are not a part of the equation. And so the UC schools are discussing in an ongoing way how they're going to address, this huge system that has many, many applicants. But for now, they are test blind, and we will, continue to monitor that as it goes. And I think we're sort of all trying to figure out over the coming sort of 5 years, different institutions are going to go in different directions, and you're going to see some of the like splitting apart of some things, people going test blind, people going test optional, people requiring tests. I think you're going to see sort of some of that breakup, not to try to predict things too much. And I think you're going to continue also to see what's always maybe been true, but is now more true than ever, that a concise testing portfolio that really just shows that you're where they want you to be in those stats, so that you can move on to the more important stuff, which is what Melanie and Bari keep talking about, these extracurriculars, who you really are, your courses, your grades, all the work you've done over 4 years. And, I do think you're going to continue to see that sort of shift.
And are schools needs blind? Different question.
Depends.
Yeah, this relates to financial aid. So certain institutions are need blind, meaning they don't take into account, or not considering whether or not you've applied for financial aid or how much financial aid you need in their admissions decisions. And in many cases, the financial aid offices and the admissions offices are literally like, different offices, sometimes on different floors in different spaces. But the bottom line is that they're separate. And then, you have to have a certain level of resources as an institution to be able to do that. So you don't have a lot of schools that are truly need blind. You'll see that you have some schools like a Tufts, for instance, that are need blind for X% of the class. And then for the remainder, I forget if it's around 10%, 5%, whatever it is, the latter percent, then they become need blind. So, institutions are trying to do it as much as they can, but this is an important question, obviously, to look into. Find out if the institution that you're applying to is need blind, and also understand what the merit aid, a policy is. There are certain schools that your admissions application just automatically will consider you for merit aid. And then there are other schools where there's a separate application, or where the FAFSA still needs to be filled out for merit aid. So there's, again, a lot of case by case policies, but need blind, and typically the way that it comes into the admissions sort of equation is just, you want to know whether or not a school cares or is taking into consideration whether you're applying for financial aid, and if so, what your need is. Because if they are, you might find that a student who has need might not be admitted because they've run out of money or run out of funds, and a student who doesn't have need will be admitted. So it is a really important piece to be aware of.
Places can be meet full need, even though they are not need blind. So there's plenty of places that, because of their finances, cannot just admit sort of indiscriminate from ability to pay, but yet the students who they do admit, they meet that full need, that full financial need that the family displays through the financial aid process. So not to worry that someplace that isn't need blind will sort of shortchange every financial aid package in an effort to save their money. It doesn't usually or always work that way. They can go sort of hand in hand, meeting full need and yet not being need blind for 100% of the applicant pool.
And is there a special recruitment process for athletes?
Yes, very much so. In keeping it kind of, because it only applies to obviously a relatively small number of students, but there's a formal athletic recruitment process. It's different sport by sport, school by school. But for students who think they might be recruitable athletes in their sport, I would say you want to make sure that you get in touch with coaches early on and kind of get on their radar screens. If you're working with a club or a travel team or a coach, they're usually able to direct you for kind of which college teams might be appropriate for you. Depending on your sport, you might be able to just, easy places with easy stats that you can look up. You'd be able to see, do I fall, if I'm looking at let's say I'm a runner, you can pull up track and field and you can kind of see, or cross country and see times, right? And see where am I relative. But, it's a very long choreographed process that goes on for a long time. The timeline for recruited athletes is different. They tend to, kind of it moves up a little bit. There's a whole lot of nuances to that, but I think the easy generic answer is absolutely there is. It does differ based on sport and institution, and it is a parallel process that happens. And we always encourage students who are doing work with recruited athletes every year. You have your athlete, kind of your recruitment list. If it works out at a school that you're interested in that also wants to recruit you. And then you have to have sort of the B list, which is that it doesn't work out. Let's say that you're ultimately like a final recruit for that particular team or at a particular school, or God forbid you get injured or whatnot. So it's really important to kind of also have sort of a parallel process going in case you don't end up getting one of the very few coveted spots, because that's not only does the coach want you, but admissions also has to give the okay and the green light. And there's certainly been many times where coaches have wanted students and admissions says no. And so you have to be really careful when coaches are encouraging that you're making it through the whole process and that you don't sort of, kind of jump ahead.
Barry, can you see if there are things in the chat that I don't have access to that maybe we should be covering?
Absolutely.
I can chat about APs. I noticed a little thing in the chat about AP exams. We can talk about that. So this is, and the subject test too. I know people wonder about these other tests. And, I guess my really short answer is when it comes to admissions, overwhelmingly, you need either the SAT or the ACT, and which choice is the key decision for a parent or a 10th grader. That's the real thing to think about. But there are other tests, and there used to be these things called subject tests, the SAT subject tests. I think Georgetown still wishes they were there. They still pine for them.
They want any test and all tests, even ones that don't exist.
Even the ones that don't exist. But they're gone. They're really gone. Like you can't
retired. They retired.
Right. They retire. They're retired. Exactly. And so really, when you're talking about overwhelmingly admissions, when you go to their standardized testing section, you're going to see SAT, ACT, SAT code, ACT, SAT, ACT. So that's the central decision. The exception there is some international schools, do want to see AP scores, and I think a couple of them still want to see quite a few very good AP scores. Oxford being one that comes to mind. So there's some exceptions in the admissions process, but generally AP exams are not used for admissions. They could be, but generally that's not really an admissions test. So those are tests that are either maybe your school still has AP courses, then it's pretty standard. You take AP chemistry and then you sit for the AP chemistry exam in May at your school, just like all the other kids in your AP Chem. And there are schools that absolutely offer AP courses. They're considered the most rigorous courses usually at that school, and they host the tests and the kids take them. And I think Melanie and Bari would be like, it's like the period at the end of your sentence. Like, you're taking AP Chem, you took the AP test. We know you took the test, like, where's the score, right? But it's not a requirement, but it's just like, it's a missing little period if you are in an AP class. So if your child is in an AP class, they should do well on the AP test, right? Even if it doesn't count towards their grade, even if it's part of. And then there are other schools who don't offer AP classes, but who actually do offer the test. They say, you don't like, you can sit for the AP literature or the AP bio, and even though we have advanced bio, not AP bio, our kids still do well on those tests, and so they still kind of host them. And a kid might do that because they get college credit from them. A lot of schools still will accept AP scores, high AP scores. They'll accept college credit, and probably not a ton of you are thinking about that yet, but when it comes time to get to college, like, those credits can be hugely helpful, especially if your college has a lot of requirements. So another reason kids take the test is really just to get that credit later on when they get in. To me, it's like, is it an easy win or is it detracting from something? And I think Bari and Melanie and I always want the priorities to be right when it comes to the strategy, right? And like, what's so important? Well, those grades, like, you can't. I talk to kids all the time right now. I talk to burnt out juniors. I talk to 10th graders. You don't get to redo your math final, usually. You don't get to redo the term paper. Yes, your grades count a lot to getting you to be a serious applicant. So when you start saying, well, should I study for my AP exam, even though there's no AP test at my school? Should I sign up somewhere and try to get a 5 and then my chem grade goes down? Yeah. That's to us, that's like lunacy. It's like putting the wrong thing in the place. It's never the most important thing, unless maybe you love Oxford, and I think that's still true. But other than Oxford, it's really not. And then sometimes kids are like, it's easy to sit and get a 5. Well, sure, if it's easy, if it's an easy win, that doesn't detract. And I think that's how I think about my kids' time a lot in general, right? Like, what are we getting for this time? Are we getting an easy win? Are we getting a hard win? Do we need it? Would it be nice? And that really depends on where your child goes to school, what classes they're taking, how their high school deals with that whole thing. So no more subject tests. APs are still around, and it's just, they're sort of school dependent, and certainly not the priority when it comes to your child's high school process.
Thank you.
Actually, one of the questions I didn't ask you earlier, Sasha, is how do kids actually move their scores on these tests?
Yes, I do want to break that down, and I also want to quickly, and I want to remember to tell the 9th graders about what's coming. But what I love about these tests is, to me, I really do think they are very teachable. And there's sort of 3 things I think. I guess I think of them as foreign languages, right? So of course you don't really speak Russian or you don't speak French, but you can learn how to speak those languages, right? And so I like to frame it that way to children, because I want them to understand that like a foreign language, they're not meant to already know the game. They're not already meant to know this foreign language. Game, language, I can mix my metaphors all night here. But when I break it down, I really think there are 3 pieces that anyone getting a perfect score on these tests has sort of mastered. There's three pieces that everyone who's getting a perfect score has mastered. The first category is content and skills. I mean, there's just no getting around it. You need certain algebra skills, geometry, you need to read at a certain level. There's grammar rules. You need to be able to analyze text quickly. You need to read at a certain speed, right? There's just, fourth graders don't take these tests, right? There's a reason. There's just stuff on it that is content based facts, right? Like where a comma goes, or skills, how to read at a certain level and understand. And overwhelmingly, that's not the category where my kids struggle, but there's always areas, there's always places. And for some kids, their grammar's perfect and there's math that needs to be shored up. So that's category one. And there's no getting a perfect score if your category one is weak, or there are holes there. And then category two is where I think, experts come in, right? That's, to me, patterns and procedures. Every single piece of the ACT, the SAT, the AP, the old subject tests, the GRE, all of them, they all have predictable patterns that we've spent 20 years understanding at a very deep level. And those patterns are not obvious to stressed out 16-year-olds, but they're very obvious to me. And some of the patterns are big, they're timing, and some of them are small. This particular trap, this particular type of question. And as children learn the patterns, they're starting to be young adults, learn these patterns, then there are subsequent procedures that really correspond to each pattern. Every time I see a comma, I do this. Every time I see this type of data passage, I do this. And those patterns and procedures allow us to beat the game. Because your grammar, but then it's a game and you got to beat the game. And so you think, well, I got all the patterns and the procedures and the content, I'm good to go. But then I think this is the piece that's most ignored. There's a piece called performance. And it doesn't matter if you have piece one and piece two, if you have strep throat, if you're upset with your boyfriend or mad at your best friend or sad or sick or tired or anxious, or bored or distracted or cold, that's going to have an impact on your ability to perform the things you know how to do, just as when you play tennis or perform on stage. And so, there's that's the final category that requires very concrete simulations of this experience, lots of conversations about what's going on during testing, and very careful preparation for the inevitable feelings and thoughts that I think accompany this kind of experience for our very anxious, stressed out, kids who have worked so hard. So those are the three categories to me. And if you really can just diagnose, isolate, and attack those three, and kind of the last one last, then I see scores move incredibly.
I know we're getting really short on time. I know you're so amazing, and I know you're available to anyone who wants to be. Bari, is there one question that is burning across all of them, or?
There's, I think, one question that will be helpful because it touches on a few different things. Somebody asked about when the actual applications open up, and is it better to submit earlier rather than later? And I actually think it kind of touches on a lot of different things. So it's a great thing to end with. I'll say a few things, and then Melanie jump in. So generally speaking, the Common App opens up on August 1. Sometimes they'll release it a couple hours early. It does close for a couple of weeks prior, where they're doing system maintenance. If you have an account now, it will roll over. You can roll it over after those 2 weeks, so it will save the data. There's some things like in the supplements, don't fill anything out in those, but in the main application, the data will roll over. And there's no reason, by the way, that you should feel like, oh my God, I've got to schedule. I got to open an account now. But for those of you who have, it will roll over. But it starts August 1 for the Common App. Institutional applications obviously do their own thing, but I would think of August 1 as the generic date, give or take. For schools that are rolling admission, that means that they accept applications, they make decisions and send them out on a rolling basis. Earlier is better. The application opens up, start working on it. Sometimes they announce their essay questions in advance, so you can be working on it sooner. And generally speaking, earlier better. Never sacrifice quality for time. Spend the extra couple of weeks and submit a good application, then rush to get, a subpar one in. But when it comes to places that have just, early action, early decision, 1 or 2, regular decision. Nobody is at NYU is reading an application if you submit it on August 2nd and rewarding you for doing so quickly. More likely, not that they're ever looking at the timestamp, but they're like, what's this about? Why is this kid submitting so early? So use your time wisely, right? The applications will open up. You'll see that some of the schools won't even have their supplements up yet on August 1. The main app will be up, but the supplements won't. Use your time wisely. Submit, don't wait until the last minute, but don't rush to send something in no matter what. Do pay attention if it's rolling, however. I wouldn't wait, for a rolling admission school if the deadline for early action is November 1. I wouldn't be submitting it in, like latter part of October. That's going to be late for that school. But anything else, realistically, and I always say actually to my students, we're done with a lot of applications well in advance of the deadline, but we would never hit submit. Once you hit submit, the application locks and you can't make any changes or updates, or if you do, you've got to request them as almost like a postscript, which you don't want to do. It's like you want to keep control for as long as you can. And so hang on to it. First of all, sometimes you finish an essay in August and then you go back to it at the end of September and you realize, oh, with a little distance from this, I want to make a couple of tweaks, or I actually got a job. You're not anticipating this stuff, but stuff comes up for seniors all the time in fall. And so things actually might come up that you want to add. And so don't be so fast to hit submit, but also don't wait until the last minute either. And Melanie, I don't know if you have anything to add about the timing.
No, not really, other than you submit application by application. So you can put one in, and then if there's some reason to change something in an essay or you can do that, right? It's not like you click one time and away they all go. I would also say that I think sometimes families get caught up about or sort of stymied because they haven't 100% decided where the student is applying, but that can kind of wait or be happening concurrent with the filling out the Common App and writing the essay and the extracurricular list and asking your teachers for the letters of recommendation and all of those things, right? Because that's all going to go everywhere, right? You're going to need that essay everywhere. Yes, the supplements are the supplements, but the heart of that application, if these are institutions taking the Common App, and the vast majority of the places students are applying are probably doing that, you're going to need the Common App. So doing the Common App and everything sort of attendant on it is helpful across the board while you're sorting out the balance of the list, or what's that ED school going to be.
Yeah, we often will have students who are kind of stuck between 2 ED schools. Which one are they going to do? And so we just put those 2 at the front and we say, all right, you'll go back and visit and stay overnight, but both will be ready. And then when you make your decision, you'll know which one you're going to click, submit on for November 1. You absolutely can still be sort of in the process, but move the essay and application process along. It's a great point. And I think we're at time. Thanks to everybody.
Oh my God, thanks to you. Amazing panel. And again, I know Sasha, Melanie, Bari, you'll make yourself available should anyone have follow-up questions, but thank you for an incredibly insightful and dynamic evening.
Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.